The alien queen killed every servant, until one human janitor said, "No," and lived. Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. The palace of Queen Valera stretched across the crimson sky of Thixia Prime like a crown of obsidian and silver, a monument to absolute power and merciless beauty. Within its towering halls, servants moved like shadows, terrified of drawing the attention of their ruler, knowing that one mistake, one moment of perceived disrespect, meant instant death. But on a cold morning when three suns rose over the palace gardens, a human janitor named Ethan Cole would do something no servant had ever done and survived. Ethan pushed his cleaning cart down the eastern corridor of the palace's 7th level, his footsteps echoing softly against the polished black stone floor. He had been working in Queen Valera's palace for 6 months now, ever since his transport ship had been captured by Thysian raiders, and he had been sold into service to pay off the supposed debt for his rescue. The irony was not lost on him. He had been trained as an environmental engineer before taking a job on a deep space mining station. But now he spent his days mopping floors and emptying waste receptacles for an alien monarch whose reputation for cruelty was whispered about across a dozen star systems. The queen herself was a Thysian, a species known throughout the galaxy for their imposing physical presence and their rigid hierarchies. Thixians stood nearly 8 feet tall on average, with chitinous exoskeletons that ranged in color from deep purple to midnight black. Their faces were angular and severe, with 4 eyes arranged in a diamond pattern and mandibles that could crush bone with minimal effort. Queen Valera was considered exceptionally beautiful by Thysian standards, her exoskeleton polished to a mirror shine, decorated with precious metals that had been surgically embedded into her armor-like skin. She wore flowing robes of crimson silk that contrasted sharply with her dark purple exterior, and her presence commanded absolute silence and submission from everyone in her orbit. Ethan had seen the queen only 3 times in his 6 months of service, and each time he had followed protocol perfectly, dropping immediately to his knees with his forehead pressed to the floor until she passed. He had watched other servants make mistakes, seen them look up at the wrong moment, or fail to move quickly enough out of her path. The results were always the same. The queen's personal guards, towering Thysian warriors in ceremonial armor, would drag the offending servant away. Sometimes the executions happened in public, in the palace's central courtyard, as a reminder to everyone else. Other times the servants simply disappeared, and their bodies were found later in the disposal chambers. The mortality rate among palace servants was staggering. Ethan had calculated that the average lifespan of a servant in Queen Valera's employ was approximately 4 months. He had already outlasted most of his peers through a combination of caution, strict adherence to protocol, and sheer luck. But he knew that luck was a finite resource, especially in a place like this. As Ethan worked his way through his assigned section, carefully cleaning the intricate geometric patterns carved into the floor, he heard a commotion from the grand hall nearby. Raised voices, the sharp click of armored feet moving quickly, and then a sound that made his blood run cold, a wet, gurgling scream that was cut off abruptly. He kept his eyes on his work, forcing himself not to react, not to show any sign that he had heard anything unusual. Curiosity was dangerous here. Emotion was dangerous. The only safe approach was to be as invisible and mechanical as possible. But then he heard footsteps approaching his corridor, and he recognized the distinctive rhythm of the Queen's gait. She walked with a measured, precise cadence, each step calculated to project absolute authority. Ethan immediately abandoned his cleaning cart and dropped to his knees, pressing his forehead to the cold stone floor. His heart hammered in his chest, but he kept his breathing steady and quiet. The footsteps grew closer, accompanied now by the lighter steps of several attendants and the heavier tread of guards. The Queen's voice rang out, sharp and imperious. She was speaking in Thysian, a language Ethan had learned enough of to understand basic commands and insults. Her words dripped with contempt as she addressed someone in her entourage. He caught fragments of the conversation, something about incompetence, about disappointment, about examples that needed to be made. Then the footsteps stopped, directly in front of him. Ethan held perfectly still, not daring to breathe too loudly. Seconds stretched into what felt like hours. Then the queen spoke again, this time in the common trade language that served as the galaxy's lingua franca. Her voice was cold and precise, each word enunciated with crystalline clarity. "Your work is adequate, human," she said. "You will attend me in the throne room in 1 hour. Do not be late." Then she swept past him, her robes rustling against the stone floor, her entourage following in her wake. Ethan remained on the floor for a full minute after the footsteps faded, his mind racing. Being summoned by the queen was never good news. He had seen others receive such summons, and very few of them returned to their duties. He considered running, but where would he go? The palace was surrounded by automated defense systems, and the city beyond was no safer for an escaped human servant. The Thysian authorities would return him to the palace in chains, and his punishment would be far worse than whatever the queen had planned. With trembling hands, Ethan finished his current task and then made his way to the servants' quarters to clean himself up. He scrubbed his face and hands, changed into the cleanest uniform he had, and tried to prepare himself mentally for whatever was coming. Other servants in the quarters gave him pitying looks, but said nothing. Everyone knew what a summons to the throne room meant. 58 minutes later, Ethan stood outside the massive doors of the throne room, his heart pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat. 2 guards flanked the entrance, their faces impassive behind their ceremonial helmets. At exactly 1 hour after the queen's command, the doors swung open with a deep, resonant groan, and one of the guards gestured for Ethan to enter. The throne room was a vast chamber with a ceiling that soared at least 40 feet overhead, supported by columns of black stone veined with silver. The floor was polished to a mirror shine, reflecting the eerie blue light that emanated from luminescent crystals embedded in the walls. At the far end of the room, elevated on a platform of 7 steps, sat Queen Valera's throne, a massive construction of precious metals and dark stone that seemed to absorb the light around it. The queen herself sat motionless on her throne, her 4 eyes fixed on Ethan as he walked the length of the room toward her. He had been coached on the proper protocol by an older servant during his first week. Walk with steady, even steps. Do not look directly at the queen. Stop at the prescribed distance, 15 feet from the base of the throne platform. Kneel immediately and remain kneeling until given permission to rise or speak. Ethan followed every instruction perfectly, dropping to his knees at exactly the right spot and lowering his head in submission. The silence in the throne room was absolute, broken only by the faint hum of the luminescent crystals and his own carefully controlled breathing. "Human," the queen's voice rang out, echoing off the stone walls. "You have been in my service for 6 lunar cycles. This is an unusual accomplishment. Most of your kind do not survive half that time." Ethan said nothing, knowing he had not been given permission to speak. "Look at me," the queen commanded. Slowly, Ethan raised his head and met the queen's gaze. Her 4 eyes glittered with an intelligence that was both fascinating and terrifying. She studied him in silence for a long moment, her mandibles clicking softly in what might have been thought or amusement. "Tell me, human, why do you think you have survived when so many others have perished? Speak truthfully." Ethan's mouth was dry, but he forced himself to answer in a clear, steady voice. "I follow the rules precisely, Your Majesty. I perform my duties without complaint or error. I make myself as small and unobtrusive as possible, and I never question or challenge the order of things." The queen's mandibles clicked again, more rapidly this time. "A diplomatic answer, but incomplete. Do you know why I kill my servants, human?" Ethan hesitated, sensing the danger in this question. "To maintain discipline, Your Majesty. To ensure perfection in your service." Queen Valera rose from her throne in one fluid motion, her robes settling around her like blood on water. She descended the 7 steps with measured grace, her eyes never leaving Ethan's face. He fought the urge to look away, sensing that to do so now would be interpreted as cowardice or disrespect. "Wrong," she said, her voice sharp as a blade. "I kill my servants because they are weak, because they allow fear to make them clumsy, stupid, pathetic, because they grovel and whimper and beg for mercy when they should accept their failures with dignity." She stopped directly in front of Ethan, towering over him. "I kill them because I despise weakness, and weakness is the only thing they ever show me. Ethan felt a chill run down his spine, but kept his expression neutral. The queen circled him slowly, like a predator examining prey. You, however, are different. I have observed you, human. Not personally, but through my surveillance systems. You do not grovel. You do not whimper. You show appropriate deference. Yes, but there is something else beneath it. Something that does not reek of fear and desperation. Tell me what that is. Ethan took a slow breath, choosing his words with extreme care. Acceptance, Your Majesty. I understand my position. I understand the reality of my situation. Fear would not change it. Panic would not improve it. So I choose to perform my duties to the best of my ability and accept whatever consequences may come. The queen stopped in front of him again, leaning down so that her face was level with his. Her breath smelled of something sweet and metallic. For a being whose species considered her beautiful, she was utterly alien to Ethan's human sensibilities, but he found himself struck by the intensity in her eyes. Interesting, she said softly. You claim to accept your position, yet you do not truly submit. Not in your heart. I can see it. You are not broken. Why is that, human? Why have you not broken when others do so within days? Because breaking would serve no purpose, Ethan replied. He was walking a razor's edge now, and he knew it. If I break, I become useless. If I become useless, I die. If I die, I have no chance of ever changing my circumstances. So I endure. I adapt. I survive. The queen straightened, and to Ethan's surprise, a sound like harsh laughter escaped her mandibles. Remarkable. You speak of survival as though it is a choice you have made, rather than a condition I have imposed upon you. You speak of changing your circumstances as though such a thing were possible for a slave in my palace. She turned away from him, pacing back toward her throne. Your audacity should offend me, human. It should earn you a swift death. And yet I find myself curious. She ascended the steps and settled back onto her throne, regarding him with what might have been amusement. I am going to make you an offer, human. An opportunity to demonstrate whether your words have substance or if you are simply more articulate than the usual rabble that serves me. Ethan remained kneeling, but every nerve in his body was alert. This was unexpected. The queen did not make offers to servants. She gave commands, and those commands were obeyed or punished. 3 days from now, I am hosting a gathering of the ruling families, Queen Valera continued. The great houses of Thixia will send their representatives to my palace for a feast and celebration. My servants will, of course, attend to the needs of my guests. And they will, as always, make mistakes. They will spill drinks, drop serving platters, move too slowly, breathe too loudly. They will give me cause to punish them in front of my peers, demonstrating my absolute authority and the perfection I demand. She leaned forward slightly, her eyes glittering. But you, human, will not be serving at the feast. You will be attending as a curiosity, a pet, if you will. I will present you to my guests as an example of an inferior species that has somehow managed to survive longer than most in my service. They will mock you, insult you, perhaps even physically abuse you for their entertainment. And you will endure it all with that same calm acceptance you claim to possess. Ethan felt his stomach tighten, but kept his face impassive. And if I succeed in enduring, Your Majesty, then I will grant you a single request, within reasonable limits. Perhaps better quarters. Perhaps better food. Perhaps even a reduction in your service hours. The queen's mandibles curved in what might have been a smile. But if you fail, if you show anger or defiance or weakness, I will kill you myself, slowly and publicly, as an example to every other servant in this palace. Do you accept these terms? The smart answer would be to decline, to beg for mercy, to throw himself on the queen's clemency and hope she lost interest in this game. But Ethan had meant what he said about survival and adaptation. This was an opportunity, twisted and cruel as it was, and opportunities were rare in a place like this. I accept, Your Majesty, he said clearly. The queen's eyes seemed to gleam with satisfaction. Excellent. You will be collected from your quarters 1 hour before the feast begins. Until then, continue your regular duties. And human, she added as he began to rise, do not disappoint me. I so rarely find entertainment worth my attention. Ethan bowed deeply and backed away from the throne platform, not turning his back on the queen until he had reached the massive doors. As he exited the throne room, he felt the weight of what he had just agreed to settle over him like a physical burden. He had 3 days to prepare himself mentally for what was coming, and he suspected that no amount of preparation would truly be enough. The next 3 days passed in a blur of routine work and anxious anticipation. Ethan threw himself into his duties with even more focus than usual, finding solace in the mechanical repetition of cleaning and organizing. Other servants whispered about the upcoming feast, speculating about which of them would make fatal mistakes and how the queen would choose to execute them. Some of the newer servants were already showing signs of panic, their hands shaking as they worked, their eyes wide and haunted. Ethan tried to offer what comfort he could without drawing attention to himself. He showed a young Diluvian female, barely out of adolescence by her species standards, how to properly polish the ceremonial silver without leaving fingerprints. He helped an elderly Corthan male, whose arthritis made kneeling difficult, devise a technique for lowering himself to the floor more smoothly when the queen passed by. Small acts of kindness that might keep them alive a little longer. On the evening before the feast, Ethan lay in his bunk in the servants' quarters, staring at the ceiling and running through mental exercises his father had taught him years ago. His father had been a hostage negotiator before retiring, and he had always stressed the importance of emotional control in high-stress situations. Breathe deeply. Identify your physical reactions to stress. Acknowledge them without judgment. Separate your emotional response from your tactical assessment. Choose your actions deliberately rather than reacting impulsively. The advice had served Ethan well throughout his life, from difficult exams in school to dangerous situations on the mining station where he had worked. Now he would need it more than ever. He would be walking into a room full of powerful beings who considered him less than an animal, and they would do everything in their power to break him for their own amusement. He had to remain calm, had to endure without showing anger or weakness, and had to somehow navigate the social minefield without making a fatal mistake. The next evening, precisely 1 hour before the feast was scheduled to begin, 2 guards appeared at the servants' quarters and called for Ethan. He rose from his bunk, ignoring the pitying and curious stares from the other servants, and followed the guards through the palace corridors to a preparation chamber he had never seen before. Inside, a team of attendants waited. They were not servants, but high-ranking members of the palace staff, and they set to work on him immediately. They stripped away his simple servant's uniform and dressed him in clothing that was oddly ornate, yet clearly designed to mark him as property. The outfit consisted of loose pants and a tunic made from expensive fabric, dyed a deep blue that complemented his human skin tone, but the collar was embedded with a control device that could deliver a painful shock if activated. The attendants also fitted him with restraints around his wrists, decorative but functional, that could be magnetically locked together if needed. When they finished, one of the attendants examined him critically and nodded in satisfaction. You clean up adequately for a human. Remember your place tonight. Speak only when directly addressed. Do not make eye contact unless ordered to do so. Do not touch anything or anyone unless instructed. If you embarrass Her Majesty, your death will be neither quick nor dignified. Ethan nodded silently, and the attendants led him to a small antechamber adjacent to the great banquet hall. Through the walls, he could hear the sound of arriving guests, the clicking of mandibles in conversation, the occasional burst of harsh laughter. The feast was about to begin. A steward appeared and gestured for Ethan to follow. They entered the banquet hall through a side entrance, and Ethan's first impression was of overwhelming sensory input. The hall was massive, easily 100 feet long and 50 feet wide, with tables arranged in a U-shape around a central performance area. The tables were laden with food that was both beautiful and disturbing to human eyes, exotic dishes from dozens of worlds, arranged in elaborate displays that emphasized texture and color over any consideration for non-Thixian sensibilities. At the head table, elevated above the others, sat Queen Valera in her full ceremonial regalia. Her exoskeleton had been polished until it gleamed like dark metal, and she wore a crown of precious stones that caught the light from the chandeliers overhead. Around the other tables sat representatives of the great Thysian houses, all dressed in their finest, all radiating the predatory confidence of apex predators who had never known genuine challenge to their authority. The steward led Ethan to a small platform near the Queen's table, a space clearly designed to display curiosities or entertainment. He was positioned there and instructed to stand at attention. The Queen glanced at him briefly, her eyes unreadable, and then returned her attention to her guests. The feast began with a series of ceremonial toasts, each house representative standing to offer elaborate compliments to the Queen and subtle insults to their rivals. The language was flowery and archaic, full of references to ancient Thysian traditions and historical grievances. Ethan stood motionless, his arms at his sides, his expression neutral, and tried to make himself as unobtrusive as possible. But the Queen had other plans. After the toasts concluded and the first course was served, she rose from her seat and gestured toward Ethan. "My honored guests," she announced, her voice cutting through the murmur of conversation, "I present to you a curiosity. A human servant who has survived in my employ for 6 lunar cycles, an achievement that surpasses the lifespan of any previous servant of his species." A ripple of interest passed through the assembled guests. Several of them turned to look at Ethan with the kind of detached curiosity one might show toward an unusual insect. "Humans are weak creatures," the Queen continued, "physically fragile, emotionally unstable, prone to sentimentality and irrational behavior. They are barely suitable for the most menial tasks, and yet this one has managed to avoid fatal errors for half a solar cycle. I find this anomaly worth examining. Please, feel free to interact with my pet. Test his resilience. I am curious to see if his survival is due to genuine capability or merely exceptional luck." The invitation was all her guests needed. Within moments, a representative from House Morvac, a particularly large Thysian with deep black exoskeleton and elaborate facial markings, approached the platform. He circled Ethan slowly, his mandibles clicking in assessment. "It is small, even for a human," he observed, "and soft. Look at this flesh, so vulnerable." He reached out and grabbed Ethan's arm, squeezing hard enough to leave bruises. "No natural armor, no defensive capabilities. How does such a creature survive at all?" Ethan kept his breathing steady, his face impassive, even as pain radiated from his arm. The representative from House Morvac released him and turned to address the Queen. "With your permission, Your Majesty, I would like to test its pain threshold." Queen Valera waved a hand dismissively. "Proceed, but do not damage it beyond repair. I may still have use for it." What followed was 20 minutes of systematic torment. The Morvac representative used a small electrical prod to deliver shocks to various parts of Ethan's body, watching his reactions with scientific interest. Others joined in, some poking him with ceremonial knives just hard enough to draw blood, others asking him degrading questions designed to humiliate him. Through it all, Ethan maintained his composure, answering questions in a calm, measured voice when required, remaining silent when not, and refusing to show anger or desperation. The turning point came when a representative from House Kelver, a female Thysian with aristocratic bearing and cruel eyes, decided to test his emotional resilience. She began asking him about his life before servitude, about his family, about his hopes and dreams. When Ethan answered honestly, but without emotion, she shifted tactics. "You must hate us," she said softly, leaning close. "You must despise the Queen for keeping you here, for treating you like an animal. Tell me, human, if you could kill her, would you?" The entire hall fell silent. This was the trap, the question designed to either reveal hidden aggression or force him into obvious dishonesty. Ethan met the female's eyes steadily and considered his answer carefully. "Hate is a luxury I cannot afford," he said finally. "The Queen is what she is, a product of her culture and her position. I am what I am, a human in service. My feelings about the situation are irrelevant. I choose to survive, and survival requires adaptation, not anger." The representative from House Kelver laughed harshly. "What a diplomatic little creature. But you did not answer my question. If you could kill her without consequence, would you?" Ethan glanced briefly at the Queen, who was watching the exchange with intense interest. He returned his gaze to the questioner. "If I were capable of killing Her Majesty, I would already be far more than a mere servant, and this question would be meaningless. Since I am not capable, the question is hypothetical and serves no purpose except to test my honesty or my fear." I choose to acknowledge its irrelevance rather than provide either a pleasing lie or a dangerous truth. For a moment, the silence stretched so thin it felt like the whole room held its breath. Then Queen Valera began to laugh, a harsh, barking sound that echoed off the walls. Magnificent, she declared. You see, my friends, this is why the creature has survived. It thinks. It considers. It refuses to be baited into foolish honesty or transparent deception. She rose from her seat and descended from the high table, crossing to where Ethan stood on his platform. This is adaptation. This is what survival looks like when pursued with intelligence rather than blind instinct. She reached out and placed one clawed hand on Ethan's shoulder, the gesture almost gentle despite the sharp points that pressed against his skin. Tell me, human, what is the most important lesson you have learned in my service? Ethan met her eyes, those four glittering orbs that held depths of intelligence and cruelty in equal measure. That power and strength are not the same thing, Your Majesty. Power is the ability to impose your will on others. Strength is the ability to endure when that will is imposed upon you. You have absolute power here. But I have found a different kind of strength in accepting that reality rather than fighting against it uselessly. The Queen's mandibles curved in what was definitely a smile now. And if I offered you power, human? If I elevated you from servant to advisor, gave you authority over others, allowed you to impose your will, what would you do with it? Ethan did not hesitate. I would decline respectfully, Your Majesty. Power over others requires a willingness to dominate and punish that I do not possess. I have survived by understanding my limitations, not by pretending to capabilities I lack. Queen Valera stared at him for a long moment, and then she did something that shocked every guest in the hall. She removed her hand from his shoulder and gestured to the steward. Remove his restraints. This one has earned a measure of freedom. The steward hurried forward and unlocked the control collar and wrist restraints. Ethan rubbed his wrists where the metal had pressed against his skin, but otherwise did not move or react. You have passed my test, human, the Queen announced, loud enough for the entire hall to hear. You have demonstrated resilience, intelligence, and a capacity for honesty that I have not seen in any servant, Thaisian or otherwise. Therefore, I grant you the reward I promised. State your request. Ethan took a slow breath. This was the moment he had been thinking about for 3 days. He could ask for better conditions for himself, for easier work, for more food, for any number of personal comforts. But he had realized something during his time in the palace, something about the Queen and about the system she ruled. She respected strength and intelligence. She despised weakness. And the greatest weakness in her system was the culture of terror that made every servant pathetic and useless. Your Majesty, I request that you allow me to train the other servants in proper protocol and emotional control. The current mortality rate is wasteful. With proper instruction, servants could last longer, perform better, and reflect more positively on your household. You waste resources on constant replacement when you could have a stable, efficient staff. The hall erupted in shocked murmurs. A servant was lecturing the Queen about efficiency. It was unthinkable. Several guests rose from their seats, expecting to witness an immediate execution. But Queen Valera's eyes narrowed in thought rather than anger. You dare to criticize my methods, human? I dare to suggest an improvement, Your Majesty. You said yourself that you despise weakness. The current system creates weakness through fear. Allow me to create strength through discipline and understanding. Your servants will still obey absolutely, but they will do so through competence rather than terror. And when your guests visit, they will see perfection in execution rather than entertaining failures. The Queen circled him again, her movements predatory but thoughtful. And what makes you think you could succeed where fear has failed? Because I understand what it means to be powerless, Ethan replied. Your Thaisian servants fear you because they have fallen from privilege. They remember what it was like to have status, and the loss breaks them. I was never privileged to begin with. I understand survival from the ground up. I can teach others not to break because I know how to bend without breaking. Queen Valera stopped in front of him, and for several seconds she said nothing. Then she turned to address her guests. This human has presented an interesting proposition. A slave requesting not comfort for himself, but the authority to improve the quality of my household service. It is audacious. It is unprecedented, and it demonstrates the very kind of intelligence I have been celebrating tonight. She returned her attention to Ethan. Very well, human. I grant your request. You will be elevated from cleaning duties to the position of servant master. You will train all new servants and retrain existing ones according to your methods. You will report directly to my chief steward, and you will be held personally responsible for any failures in service. If your methods prove effective, you will be rewarded further. If they fail, you will suffer consequences that will make tonight's entertainment look like kindness. Do you accept these terms? I accept, Your Majesty, Ethan said firmly. The rest of the feast passed in a blur. Ethan was returned to the platform, but now as an object of curiosity rather than contempt. Several guests approached to ask him questions about human psychology and training methods. He answered politely and thoroughly, conscious that every word was being evaluated by the Queen and her peers. When the feast finally ended, hours later, he was escorted back to the servants' quarters, but this time by the chief steward rather than guards. You have created an extraordinary situation for yourself, human, the chief steward said as they walked. Her Majesty is mercurial. She may support your efforts tomorrow or grow bored and have you killed for her amusement. I suggest you produce results quickly. I intend to, Ethan replied. When can I begin? You begin at first light, the steward said. I will have a training chamber prepared and send you the first group of servants for instruction. You will have 2 hours with each group. Do not waste the opportunity. Ethan spent a sleepless night in his bunk, his mind racing with lesson plans and training strategies. He had bought himself a chance, but the cost of failure would be catastrophic not just for him, but for every servant he was now responsible for teaching. He had to make this work. The next morning, he was escorted to a large chamber on the 3rd level of the palace, a space that had been set up with seating and a central area where he could demonstrate and instruct. The first group of servants arrived, 12 beings from 6 different species, all looking terrified and confused about why they had been summoned. Ethan stood in front of them and took a deep breath. My name is Ethan Cole. As of last night, I have been appointed servant master by Queen Valera. My job is to teach you how to survive in this palace, not by hiding or groveling, but by understanding what is expected of you and executing those expectations with precision and calm. He spent the next 2 hours breaking down every aspect of palace protocol. He taught them how to recognize the Queen's footsteps, how to drop to the floor smoothly without appearing panicked, how to keep their breathing quiet and controlled, how to respond to commands with clarity and brevity. But more importantly, he taught them how to manage their fear. Fear is natural, he explained. Fear is useful. It keeps you alert. But panic is deadly. Panic makes you clumsy. It makes you stupid. So we are going to practice separating fear from panic. We are going to learn to acknowledge our fear, accept it, and then set it aside so we can focus on our tasks. He led them through breathing exercises, through visualization techniques, through physical drills that built muscle memory so that proper protocol became automatic rather than something they had to think about under stress. Some of the servants responded well immediately. Others struggled, their terror too deeply ingrained. But by the end of the 2 hours, every single one of them was performing better than when they had entered the training chamber. Group after group came through over the following days. Ethan refined his methods with each session, learning what worked best for different species and personality types. He created simple mantras that servants could repeat to themselves when they felt panic rising. He developed a buddy system so that more experienced servants could help newer ones. He even convinced the chief steward to establish a quiet room where servants could decompress after particularly stressful encounters with the Queen or her guests. The results were remarkable. Within 2 weeks, the mortality rate among servants dropped by 60%. Mistakes still happened. They were inevitable, but they happened less frequently and were less severe. Servants moved through the palace with more confidence, and that confidence translated into better performance. The Queen took notice. 1 month after the feast, Ethan was again summoned to the throne room. He approached the Queen with the same respectful protocol as before, but this time he felt less like prey and more like someone whose value had been proven. Your methods are effective, human, Queen Valera said without preamble. My household runs more smoothly than it has in years. My guests have commented on the improved quality of service. You have demonstrated that your species, while weak in body, possesses a certain cleverness that has practical applications. She descended from her throne and approached him, her movements as graceful and intimidating as ever. But tell me, Ethan Cole, do you not resent me still? You have elevated yourself through intelligence, yes, but you remain in service. You remain property. Does this not anger you? Ethan met her eyes calmly. Would my anger change anything, Your Majesty? No, the Queen admitted. But most beings cannot suppress their emotions so completely. They harbor resentment, and it poisons them from within. You seem immune to this poison. Why? Because resentment requires hope, Ethan said quietly. It requires believing that things should be different than they are. I do not have that luxury. I see reality clearly. I am a human in a Thysian palace. I have no leverage, no power, no realistic prospect of escape. Those are facts. I can either accept those facts and work within the constraints they impose, or I can rage against them uselessly and destroy myself in the process. I choose acceptance. The Queen studied him for a long moment. And if circumstances changed? If you suddenly found yourself with leverage, with power, with the opportunity to change your reality? Then I would evaluate my options rationally and choose the course of action most likely to result in my continued survival and well-being, Ethan replied. But I do not waste energy fantasizing about unlikely scenarios. I focus on what I can control. Queen Valera made a sound that might have been approval. You are a rare creature, Ethan Cole. In all my years of rule, I have broken thousands of beings. I have seen them grovel, beg, scheme, and die. But you are the first who has truly understood the game. She turned away, pacing back toward her throne. I am elevating you again. You will no longer be servant master. You will be my personal advisor on matters of household management and interspecies relations. You will have quarters in the palace's upper levels, appropriate clothing, and a modest salary. You will still be in my service, but your collar will be metaphorical rather than literal. Ethan felt something shift inside him, a cautious hope that he immediately tried to suppress. He bowed deeply. I am honored, Your Majesty. May I ask what prompted this further elevation? The Queen settled onto her throne, her eyes glittering with something that might have been amusement or calculation. Because you have shown me that strength comes in many forms. Physical power, political authority, military might. These are the strengths my culture values and celebrates. But you have demonstrated a different kind of strength. The strength to endure without breaking. The strength to think clearly under pressure. The strength to see reality without comforting delusions. She leaned forward slightly. And because you are useful to me, human, more useful as an advisor than as a servant. I am many things, but I am not wasteful. Over the following months, Ethan's life transformed in ways he had never imagined possible. His new quarters were luxurious by any standard, with actual windows that looked out over the palace gardens, a private bathroom, comfortable furniture, and access to the palace's extensive library and data archives. He was given clothing that marked him as a member of the palace's administrative staff rather than a servant, and he was invited to attend certain court functions in an official capacity. His role as advisor was both fascinating and challenging. The Queen consulted him on matters ranging from optimal staffing ratios to cultural sensitivities when dealing with visiting dignitaries from non-Thixian species. She seemed genuinely interested in his perspective, often asking him to explain human reasoning or emotional responses that baffled her. Their conversations were strange exercises in cross-cultural communication, with Ethan carefully navigating the gap between his species' values and Thysian worldview. But he never forgot what he was. He was still property, still completely dependent on the Queen's favor, still one mistake or mood swing away from execution. He remained disciplined, controlled, and focused on being useful without becoming threatening. He made himself invaluable while never appearing ambitious. The other servants looked at him with a mixture of awe and confusion. He had achieved what none of them had imagined possible, a genuine elevation from slavery to something approaching respected status. But he had done it not through rebellion or escape, but through perfect adaptation to the system that enslaved him. Some saw him as a hero, others as a collaborator. Ethan understood both perspectives and cared about neither. He was surviving, and survival was its own justification. One evening, approximately 8 months after the fateful feast, Ethan was working in his quarters, reviewing personnel reports and preparing recommendations for the Queen when his door chimed. He opened it to find Queen Valera herself standing in the corridor, alone and without guards or attendants. This was unprecedented. The Queen never visited the quarters of her staff. "May I enter, Ethan Cole?" she asked, her tone unusually formal. "Of course, Your Majesty," Ethan said, stepping aside. The Queen swept into his quarters, her presence somehow filling the space despite the room's generous size. She moved to the window and stood looking out at the gardens, her back to him. "I have been thinking about our conversations," she said after a long silence. "About the things you have said regarding strength and power and survival. You have made me question certain assumptions I have held throughout my life." Ethan said nothing, sensing that the Queen needed to work through her thoughts without interruption. "I was raised to believe that power is the highest virtue," she continued, "that the strong rule and the weak serve, and this natural order should never be questioned. I have built my entire identity around this belief. I have killed thousands to reinforce it. And yet you have shown me a being who possesses no power whatsoever, who lives entirely at my mercy, and who demonstrates a kind of strength that I, with all my authority and might, struggle to comprehend." She turned to face him, and Ethan was startled to see something that might have been uncertainty in her eyes. "Tell me honestly, Ethan Cole, do you believe I am evil?" The question hung in the air between them like a physical presence. Ethan considered his answer carefully, knowing that honesty was dangerous, but dishonesty would be worse. "I believe you are a product of your culture, Your Majesty. Your species evolved as apex predators in an extremely competitive environment. Your social structures are built around dominance hierarchies and displays of strength. What seems cruel to human sensibilities is, from a Thysian perspective, natural and necessary. So no, I do not believe you are evil. I believe you are doing what your evolution and culture have programmed you to do. Evil requires choice, the deliberate decision to cause harm when better options exist. I am not certain you have ever been presented with better options." The Queen's mandibles clicked softly. "That is a generous interpretation. Most beings would simply call me a tyrant and a murderer. Most beings would be speaking from anger or fear," Ethan said. "I am speaking from observation and analysis. You have created a system that prioritizes your security and authority above all else. That system has casualties, certainly. But from your perspective, those casualties are acceptable losses in the service of stability and order. And from your perspective?" "From my perspective," Ethan said slowly, "suffering is suffering regardless of whether it serves a systemic purpose. I have watched good people die in this palace for trivial mistakes. I have seen terror used as a management tool. I have experienced humiliation and pain designed to remind me of my powerlessness. These things cause harm. Whether that harm is justified within your cultural framework does not change the fact that it exists." Queen Valera moved closer to him, her 4 eyes searching his face. "And yet you do not hate me." "Hate would require emotional investment that I cannot afford," Ethan replied. "I understand you, Your Majesty. I even, in a strange way, respect certain aspects of your character. You are intellectually honest. You do not pretend to be something you are not. You acknowledge the brutality of your system rather than hiding behind comfortable euphemisms. That is worth something." The Queen was silent for a long moment. Then she said something that shocked Ethan to his core. "I am going to tell you a secret, human. Something I have never told anyone. I am tired." Ethan blinked, processing this unexpected confession. "Tired, Your Majesty?" "Tired of the constant vigilance," she said. "Tired of the endless displays of dominance. Tired of killing servants who make inconsequential mistakes because my culture demands it. Tired of being surrounded by beings who fear me but do not know me." She moved to one of the chairs in Ethan's quarters and, in an uncharacteristic gesture, sat down with obvious weariness. "I am 342 years old, Ethan Cole. I have ruled this palace for over 2 centuries. And in all that time, you are the first being who has looked at me and seen something other than a monster or a goddess. You see me as what I actually am, a person trapped in a role that I can never escape." Ethan slowly sat in the chair across from her, his mind racing. This was dangerous territory. The Queen was revealing vulnerability, and vulnerability could lead to backlash and violence when she regained her emotional equilibrium. But it was also an opportunity for genuine connection, perhaps the only one he would ever have. "What would you do if you could escape, Your Majesty?" he asked gently. The Queen's mandibles curved in a sad approximation of a smile. "An impossible question. I am the Queen. I will always be the Queen. To step down would be seen as weakness, and weakness invites challenge. I would be killed by rivals within days. So I continue, year after year, century after century, playing the role that my birth and position demand." Ethan leaned forward slightly. "With respect, Your Majesty, you are conflating escape with abdication. What if escape simply meant creating space within your role for something other than constant dominance displays? What if you could maintain your authority while gradually shifting the culture of your household towards something less exhausting?" The Queen's eyes fixed on him with sudden intensity. "Explain." "You have already begun the process," Ethan said. "When you elevated me and approved my training methods, you created a precedent. Servants in this palace now last longer and perform better because they are not paralyzed by terror. You have demonstrated that effective authority does not require constant bloodshed. What if you expanded that principle? What if you used your absolute power not just to dominate, but to transform? And how would I do this without appearing weak?" "By framing it as evolution rather than reform," Ethan said, warming to the idea as he spoke. "Dystopian culture values strength, yes, but it also values adaptation and survival. You could present changes as strategic improvements, as evidence of your superior intellect and forward-thinking leadership. You are not softening, you are optimizing. You are not showing mercy, you are demonstrating efficiency. The narrative matters as much as the action." Queen Valera sat back in her chair, her eyes distant as she considered his words. "You would make a dangerous revolutionary, Ethan Cole, if you were in a position to lead such changes yourself." "But I am not in such a position," Ethan replied. "I am your advisor. I can suggest and recommend, but you are the only one with the authority to actually implement change. And any changes you make will be attributed to your wisdom, not to the influence of a human slave. Your power remains absolute. You simply choose to exercise it differently." The Queen was silent for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was thoughtful. "I will consider what you have said, but I make no promises. Change is dangerous, even for those with absolute authority. Perhaps especially for those with absolute authority." She rose from the chair, and her demeanor shifted back to the regal bearing Ethan was more familiar with. "This conversation did not happen, human. We did not discuss my doubts or your revolutionary ideas. If you speak of it to anyone, I will deny it and have you executed for spreading malicious fabrications. Is that clear?" "Perfectly clear, Your Majesty," Ethan said, standing as well. The Queen moved toward the door, then paused. "You have been useful to me, Ethan Cole. More useful than you know. Continue in your current role and continue to surprise me with your insights. But remember always that my favor is not unconditional. Do not mistake access for safety." "I understand, Your Majesty," Ethan said. "And for what it is worth, I hope you find a way to be less tired." The Queen's mandibles clicked in what might have been amusement or sadness, and then she was gone, the door sliding shut behind her. In the months that followed, Ethan noticed subtle changes in how the Queen managed her household. She still executed servants who made serious errors, but the threshold for what constituted a serious error seemed to have shifted slightly. She began implementing some of the efficiency recommendations Ethan had made, restructuring staff rotations to reduce fatigue-related mistakes. She started holding monthly reviews where servants could provide feedback on palace operations, a concept that would have been unthinkable before. The changes were small, incremental, and always presented as evidence of the Queen's superior management skills rather than any softening of her authority. But Ethan could see the cumulative effect. The palace was becoming a marginally less terrifying place to work. Servants still lived in fear, but it was a more manageable fear, one that did not paralyze them completely. Ethan himself settled into his role with a mixture of satisfaction and existential disquiet. He had achieved safety and comfort, had become genuinely valued for his contributions, and had even managed to reduce suffering for others in small but meaningful ways. But he was still property. He still had no freedom of movement beyond the palace grounds. No control over his ultimate fate. No real power despite his proximity to power. One evening, nearly a year after his initial elevation to advisor, Ethan was summoned to the Queen's private chambers, a space he had only entered once before to deliver urgent reports. When he arrived, he found the Queen seated at a desk, reviewing documents. She gestured for him to sit. "I have made a decision," she said without preamble. "A decision that concerns you directly." Ethan felt his heart rate increase, but kept his expression neutral. "Yes, Your Majesty? I am granting you freedom," the Queen said, her eyes watching his reaction carefully. Not immediately, and not without conditions, but freedom nonetheless. Ethan felt the world tilt slightly. He had dreamed of freedom in abstract terms, but had never seriously expected it to become reality. "What are the conditions, Your Majesty?" "You will remain in my service for 2 more years," the Queen said. "During that time, you will train a suitable replacement for your current role. You will document your methods and insights so that your knowledge is not lost when you depart. And you will serve as my advisor on a specific project that I am undertaking." "What project, Your Majesty?" The Queen leaned back in her chair. "I am establishing a cultural exchange program with several other species in this sector. I want to demonstrate that Thixia is capable of sophisticated diplomacy, not just military dominance. I need someone who understands non-Thixian psychology and can help me navigate the complexities of interspecies relations without causing incidents. You are uniquely qualified for this role." "And after 2 years?" Ethan asked. "After 2 years, you will be granted citizenship in the Thysian Commonwealth as a free person. You will receive a stipend based on your service record. You will have the right to travel, to work where you choose, to live as you see fit." She paused. "You will also have the option, should you wish it, to remain in my employ as a paid consultant. But that will be your choice, not my command." Ethan sat in stunned silence, trying to process what he had just heard. Freedom. Actual freedom. The thing he had stopped allowing himself to hope for was being offered to him. "Why, Your Majesty?" he finally asked. "Why are you doing this?" The Queen's expression was unreadable. "Because you were right. That conversation we did not have, about being tired and trapped in roles. You were right. I cannot escape my position, but I can change what that position means. And part of that change is recognizing that slavery, while traditional in my culture, is inefficient and morally questionable." She met his eyes. "I am not freeing all the servants in my palace. That would be too radical, too destabilizing. But I am starting with you, as an experiment. If you thrive as a free person and continue to contribute meaningfully, it will prove that freedom can coexist with loyal service. And perhaps, over time, that demonstration will allow me to expand the program. So I am still serving a purpose for you," Ethan said slowly. "Even in my freedom. Everything serves a purpose," the Queen replied. "The question is whether the purpose is mutually beneficial. I believe this arrangement benefits us both. You gain your freedom. I gain a powerful demonstration of progressive leadership. And perhaps we both gain something less tangible, the satisfaction of knowing that we have moved beyond the roles that were imposed upon us by circumstances." Ethan took a deep breath, feeling tears prick at his eyes for the first time in over a year. He blinked them away quickly, maintaining his composure. "I accept your offer, Your Majesty, and I will serve to the best of my ability for the next 2 years." The Queen inclined her head in acknowledgement. "Good. We begin the cultural exchange project next week. You will have much to do." The next 2 years were the most intense and rewarding of Ethan's life. He threw himself into the cultural exchange program, helping to design protocols that allowed Thysian officials to interact with representatives from dozens of species without causing offense or incidents. He trained diplomatic staff in cross-cultural communication. He wrote extensively about human and non-Thixian psychology, creating resources that would benefit future Thysian diplomats. He also trained his replacement, a young Thysian named Selvik who had been born into a lower house and possessed a rare curiosity about other species. Ethan shared everything he had learned about managing the palace household, about understanding non-Thixian servants, about balancing efficiency with compassion. Selvik proved to be an excellent student, and Ethan felt confident that the progress they had made would continue after his departure. During this time, his relationship with Queen Valera evolved into something neither of them had expected, a genuine friendship, or as close to friendship as was possible between a monarch and a former slave. They continued to have long conversations about philosophy, culture, and leadership. The queen shared stories from her long life, and Ethan offered perspectives from his human upbringing. They disagreed frequently, sometimes sharply, but always with mutual respect. When the 2 years finally ended, the queen held a formal ceremony in the throne room to grant Ethan his freedom. It was attended by palace staff, representatives from the great houses, and even a few ambassadors from other species. The queen gave a speech in which she praised Ethan's intelligence and dedication, and presented his freedom as evidence of Thysian enlightenment and progressive values. It was political theater, but it was also sincere in its own way. "Ethan Cole," the queen declared, "you came to this palace as a slave, captured and sold by circumstances beyond your control. You survived through intelligence, adaptability, and strength of character. You have served me and my household with distinction, and you have contributed to the betterment of Thysian society through your insights and innovations. It is therefore my honor and privilege to grant you full citizenship in the Thysian Commonwealth, with all the rights and protections that status confers. You are free, Ethan Cole, free to choose your own path." She approached him with a ceremonial document, the official record of his citizenship, and handed it to him. As she did, she leaned close and spoke quietly, so only he could hear. "You taught me something important, human. You taught me that saying no, refusing to be what others expect you to be, is sometimes the greatest act of strength. Thank you." Ethan took the document, his hands trembling slightly. "Thank you, Your Majesty, for everything." The ceremony concluded, and Ethan was escorted to his new quarters outside the palace, a modest but comfortable apartment in the city. He stood at the window, looking back at the palace where he had spent nearly 3 years of his life, and felt a complicated mixture of emotions. Relief, gratitude, sadness, pride. He had survived. He had done more than survive. He had thrived and changed the system that had tried to break him, not through rebellion or violence, but through patience, intelligence, and an unwavering commitment to seeing reality clearly and adapting to it without losing himself in the process. In the weeks that followed, Ethan began to build a new life. He accepted the Queen's offer to serve as a paid consultant, working remotely on diplomatic projects. He also started writing a book about his experiences, a careful analysis of cross-cultural dynamics and survival psychology. He made friends among the non-Thixian community in the city, people who had their own stories of adaptation and persistence. One evening, about 3 months after his liberation, he received a message from the Queen. It was brief and to the point. "Your replacement is performing well. The cultural exchange program has exceeded expectations, and I have begun discussions about gradually phasing out involuntary servitude in the palace over the next decade. You were right about many things, Ethan Cole. Change is possible, even for those of us who seem most trapped by tradition. Thank you for showing me that." Ethan smiled as he read the message and composed a careful reply. "Change is always possible, Your Majesty. It just requires the courage to imagine a different future and the patience to work toward it incrementally. I am honored to have played a small part in your journey toward that future." He sent the message and leaned back in his chair, feeling a profound sense of satisfaction. He had come to the palace as property, had endured humiliation and pain, had stood before an alien queen and said no to despair and helplessness. He had survived not by becoming hard or cruel or broken, but by staying clear-eyed and adaptive, by refusing to give up on the possibility that intelligence and patience could prevail over raw power. And in the end, he had not just survived. He had made a difference. He had reduced suffering for others. He had planted seeds of change in a culture that seemed absolutely resistant to it. He had formed an unlikely bond with a being who represented everything that had oppressed him, and through that bond, had helped her become slightly better than she had been. It was not the heroic story of rebellion and escape that people might have expected. It was quieter than that, more complicated, more human in its acknowledgement of moral ambiguity and the messy reality of change. But it was real. It was meaningful, and it was his. Ethan Cole had looked into the face of absolute power and had not blinked. He had said no to becoming a victim, no to rage and resentment, no to giving up. And somehow, Impossibly, he had lived. Not just lived, but won, on his own terms, in his own way. Years later, when people asked him how he had survived in the palace of Queen Valera, he always gave the same answer. I chose to see things as they were, not as I wished them to be. I adapted without breaking. I endured without losing myself. And I never stopped believing that even in the darkest circumstances, intelligence and humanity could make a difference. It was not a strategy that would work for everyone, he would admit. It required a specific temperament, a willingness to suppress certain emotions, a capacity for extreme patience. But it had worked for him. And in working, it had proven something important about what humans were capable of when pushed to their absolute limits. The story of Ethan Cole and Queen Valera spread throughout the sector, told and retold in a dozen variations. To some, it was a story of collaboration and compromise. To others, it was a story of survival against impossible odds. To the Queen herself, it was a reminder that strength came in many forms, and that sometimes the greatest power was the power to change. And to Ethan, it was simply his life. A life that had taken him from the mines of human space to the palace of an alien tyrant, to freedom and purpose beyond anything he had imagined. A life that proved that saying no, standing firm in the face of absolute power, was not always a death sentence. Sometimes, if you were smart enough, patient enough, and human enough, it was the beginning of something extraordinary. The janitor who had refused to break, who had looked at a queen and seen a person, who had survived by adapting without surrendering his essential humanity, had done more than just live. He had shown that humans, for all their physical weakness and vulnerability, possessed something that even the most powerful beings in the galaxy could not easily destroy: the ability to endure, to think, to grow, and to influence their circumstances through sheer force of character and intelligence. And that was the real story, not about saying no and dying, but about saying no and living, about surviving, about thriving, about being undeniably, unmistakably, impossibly human. And that was the end of the story. If you listened all the way to here, don't forget to leave feedback about what you thought of the story in the comments, whether positive or negative. Your feedback helps us improve. Also, leave your like and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this one. And I'll leave here on the screen another video that I'm sure you'll like. Big hug, and see you in the next story.